See this hat? It's the only one of its kind in the world, and I'm going to tell you more about it in a little while. Welcome to Science Fiction Saturday again. Welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I've got two space operas for you. One of which is an American one from the early 1960s. And just to be fair, the other is a Russian one from the early 1960s. One's better known than the other. One had more production values than the other. But it was kind of fun to watch them both and to compare and contrast the two movies. So let's get started with the American one, just to be fair to the demographic that covers most of my audience. The 1961 American International released science fiction space opera, The Phantom Planet, starring Dean Fredericks, Colin Gray, Tony Dexter, Francis X. Bushman, and Richard Keel in his first role. This one borrows a little bit from This Island Earth. It's in wonderful black and white, though it has been colorized. And to be fair, the colorized version looks pretty okay. I think there's a big difference between colorizing a movie like this and colorizing The Maltese Falcon, which was done about 20-25 years ago. This kind of movie, you can zhuzh it up a bit with colorization, and there aren't going to be too many people that'll kick up a fuss about it. I don't mind the colorized version. I've seen both the colorized and the black and white version, and the colorized version is just that little bit nicer. So the movie has a very pretentious monologue. I won't go into the details, but the monologue is a little bit too heavy. They kind of should have given it a little bit of a lighter touch, but they didn't. It's set in the far future year of 1980, which didn't turn out like the 1980 we have in the movie. There's a moon base, which is a launching point for space exploration, which makes sense. Getting out of the gravity well of Earth is a big ask for any science fiction, well, for any spaceship really, it's science fiction or not. And so they've got a moon base there, and they're launching a whole bunch of ships out into the solar system, and a couple of them get pranged into and destroyed by what seems to be a moving asteroid, and not moving on normal path, moving under its own volition kind of asteroid. This raises concerns with the shouty and not very good actor head of the moon base, who sends out Pegasus 4 with a guy called Frank Chapman as the captain. There's another guy in there who eventually gets killed, because there's always a secondary guy that gets killed in this kind of movie. And Frank is sent out to find out what's going on with this asteroid, which, to be fair to the movie, kind of looks like real asteroids do a lot more than the asteroids you'll see in most movies like The Green Slime and a bunch of others, where they've got round, fiery kind of asteroids. This one looks like a peanut. And there are asteroids that actually look like a peanut. The surface is a bit different on real asteroids, but they were to know that in 1961. So Frank, played by Dean Fredericks, who was a kind of interesting looking actor. He had dark hair, but his hair was always white or blonde in his later movies because his wife was a hairdresser and thought he looked better as a blonde. Who's to argue? His career ended in about 1965 when he stopped getting movie roles. He was okay in these kind of roles, but not great, you know. He's not James Dean. But if he's good, honest acting. Lovely thing about this movie, which is odd and is a little bit off-putting for some people, is both of the main male characters in it have chest hair, because people in the 1960s had chest hair, leaving aside Hercules in Peplum movies. And both of the lead actors, Anthony Dexter and Dean Fredericks, get a chance to show off their chest hair when they have a fight to the death, because you need a fight to the death in this kind of movie. You need an alien monster rampaging as well. You need lots of spaceships zooming around, and you need a weird little civilization, which they get in this. It's a Lost Kingdom kind of movie set on an asteroid in the middle of the solar system. Pegasus 4 goes out and finds this asteroid, and the ship lands on it. But what they don't know is that there's a civilization on this asteroid of very tiny people, 6 inches tall. And in this case, 6 inches does mean 6 inches. Something about the atmosphere on the planetoid shrinks people down, and when Captain Chapman jumps out of his spaceship and accidentally cracks his faceplate, he shrinks down to the size of the locals and gets taken back to the main area underground where all of the locals live. And so there's a Gulliver's Travel aspect to this one, which I kind of like. It's mixing up a few different things and stirring the pot a bit and trying to pick up something original. The asteroid's called Rayton, which sounds a bit like something you use as a fabric softener. And the guy in charge is a character called Sesson played by Francis X. Bushman, who was the original Ben-Hur, I think, in the 1925 Ben-Hur movie. Let me check this out for you and I'll verify. No, he was actually Masala in Ben-Hur. He had the role taken by Stephen Boyd in the more famous Ben-Hur movie. So I made a slight error there. Anthony Dexter plays Heron. Anthony Dexter, his only claim to fame was in the early 1950s, because he looked a bit like him. He did a Rudolph Valentino biopic called Valentino for a major Hollywood studio, and he wasn't able to parlay that into a longer and more successful career in film. Now, the cool thing about Raytheon is they are wizards at controlling gravity. That's the reason why the spaceships kept pranging into the asteroid, because they control their gravity and move around using a gravity field. The ships encounter the gravity field and glitch and blow up. They've also got a bunch of enemies called the Solarites, who live somewhat closer to the sun. It's a bit vague where they live. And they're ugly-looking monsters. They're a little bit kind of like the Metaluna mutants, if the Metaluna mutants were made by a toy company. They've got kind of buggy eyes, they've got little beaky mouths, and they're played by Richard Keel in the movie. The people on Raytheon have one of them captured and have had it captured for about 20 years in this little cell. So I think that's against the Geneva Convention to keep someone in prison without giving you a hostage exchange for 20 odd years, but they do that. Eventually it escapes and it runs around. Meanwhile, Chapman is encountering Raytheon's civilization, and the people on Raytheon, including Casson, the head guy, say, yep, you've got to live here now. We don't really have an easy way of getting you back to where you live. We don't want Earth to know that we're here. And so you've got to live here, and you've got to pick one of these chicks to be your wife. It is the 1960s. What can you do? And that thing puts him into a love triangle with the other guy, played by Tony Dexter. And they then decide they're going to fight to the death. Now, the way you fight to the death is you have this big pole, and both guys are at the other end of this big pole with two handles on it. And you've got to wrestle the other person onto this metal plate, which has an incredibly high gravity field on it. And if you land on the plate, the gravity will crush you and disintegrate you. It won't turn you into paste or anything like that. It'll just disintegrate you like that. And they just have these lying around their main council chamber for no good reason. I suppose it's okay for getting rid of rubbish, maybe, and food scraps. But they've got it there, and they have this wrestling match. And of course, Frank Chapman, being the red-blooded American guy he is, overpowers, but he doesn't kill him because he's a red-blooded American guy, and he never does that when other people are looking. So then they end up being buddies. The Solarite monster gets loose. The Solarites attack Raytheon and start trying to blast it, and the Raytheons eventually defeat them. Sesson gets injured by the Solarite and is out of the picture. Heron is the de facto leader of the place and finds a way to get Chapman close enough to the moon so that his people can pick him up. And it may all have been a dream, except for the fact he has a little gemstone that was given to him by the girl he loves. And he realizes that, yes, it all happened. And yes, there is a tiny little planetoid in the solar system with a whole bunch of character actors running the show. I kind of like this one. I remember seeing it in the early 1960s on TV when I was but a child. The production values are fairly good for this kind of film, and the special effects are as good as you can expect from this kind of film. The plot is all over the place. It does borrow a little bit from This Island Earth, particularly the Metaluna mutant thing, and the guy getting taken to a weird civilization. There's that aspect of it as well. It kind of works, and when I saw it as a child, I really liked it. I liked the idea of having a gravity plate on the floor where if you throw anything onto it, it gets disintegrated. I could have used that in my childhood, though I probably would have gone into some kind of a welfare system had I used it the way I wanted to. But leaving that aside, it's very much an early 1960s B picture. I've got a really old copy of it on DVD, but it's still watchable. It's still a bit of fun. I've got the Holly Weird one. Now, a lot of people here in Australia remember the Holly Weird movies from Payless Entertainment, which were very early purveyors of Fine Things DVD. I haven't really seen this around on any physical media since then, here in Australia at least. But I've got a nostalgic love of these ones. a lot of movies came out on this. The Brain from Planet Arris came out on this. Plan 9 from Outer Space did. Glen or Glenda, I think, came out as well. I'll have to check my shelves to see. But the Hollywood ones are great. They've got colorized images on the back, which is kind of fun. These are very basic DVDs, but they're the way you can find the movies. Yes, of course, they are on YouTube. They are on torrents. You can get them any number of ways. But I kind of like this one because it's retro. It feels retro. And it's a bit weird to think that there are DVDs now that are retro artifacts in the same way a VHS tape is, or an old comic book. These are over 20 years old now, and they're becoming retro artifacts. And I'm glad I've got a copy of that one. I haven't watched it for a few years. It holds up well as that kind of movie that when I saw it when I would have been like 6 or 7, it was the best movie ever. Because when you're 6 or 7, if you see a movie and you enjoy it, it's the best movie ever until the next one comes along. That's just the nature of being 6 or 7 years old. Doesn't matter what the movie is. If it kicks it all, it's the best movie ever until the next one. The Phantom Planet I enjoyed for that reason, and I know there are a lot of monster kids out there who feel the same way about it. None of the actors are fantastic. None of them are covering themselves in glory. The special effects kind of work. The monster is absurd. The space battles are rudimentary but earnestly done. And it's satisfying without a lot of cringe. There's a little bit of mentioning God in there, which is pretty much par for the course in the early 1960s and doesn't play well to this particular atheist. In some ways it works. In some ways it's a perfect artifact of its time. The early 1960s was the kind of movie that was shown at drive-ins as a second feature. It was the kind of movie that was dumped into syndication bundles for television stations, both here and in America in particular. I've got a little bit of a crush on this movie, even though I can pick it apart 15 different ways. I like the fact that they use gravity technology as the main technology that the people on Rayton tend to use. They've eschewed a lot of the trappings of high technological civilization and decided they want to do a lot of things old-fashioned, except for the stuff that maintains their planet. And I can understand that. It's got a slight ecologically adjacent message like, don't use your technology for everything, only use it for the things you actually need the technology for. And that's a very forward-looking attitude for a movie like this to take. But I saw The Phantom Planet and I enjoyed it, and I decided to match it up with a Russian science fiction movie, which is arguably one of the 2 or 3 best ones of the era. But before we get on to the second movie, I've got to mention The Hat. The Hat is one of Middle-Aged Geek Girl's designs, and her company, Mag Designs, has a Redbubble store where there are a whole bunch of really vastly varied Halloween things going up at the moment. You can get them on t-shirts, you can get them on hats, you can get them on bags, you can get them on leggings, you can get them on all sorts of different things based on her design. I'm going to post a link to her Redbubble store and any other store that she's got. She's got a couple of them on different platforms. And she's got some really groovy looking Halloween designs this year. So I thought I would wear the hat. And like I said, this is the only one like that in the world right at this moment. And I like the Andy Warhol pumpkin kind of theme of this one. So I'll post a link to that. And she gave me this one for free. So thank you, Middle-Aged Geek Girl. I love you. And if you want to, buy some things from her. It'll help keep the cats in cat food. On to the second movie, which was pinched twice by Roger Corman. It's a 1960, it says 1960 in some places, it says 1962 in others. It's a little vague on the exact date of it. And it was actually made in Leningrad, not Moscow, so it isn't a Mosfilms movie. But it is very much a space opera, and very much a space opera that tries to get as much as possible the science right. Planeta Burr, the Planet of Storms. Now, there's no good copies of this movie. It's in a 3:2 aspect ratio because that's how the film was shown. It's got burnt in subtitles in English. Because it's made in a filmmaking process called Sovcolor, which is kind of an Agfacolor equivalent in the Soviet Union at the time, the color stock's faded, so the color values aren't great. If somebody does an updated and tweaked version of it in the future, I wouldn't be unhappy about it. I think it's a movie that might well benefit from that, but it is what it is at the present moment. Now, this copy of it is a pretty groovy one. It was fairly cheap, and it also includes the 2 movies that Roger Corman stole footage from these movies. Well, didn't steal it. He was given the rights to using footage from Planeta on 2 of his movies from the 1960s. Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet in 1965 and Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women in 1968. Now, the second movie was actually made by Peter Bogdanovich. And what Corman did, I'm going to talk about the main movie, but I'll talk about Corman first, is you got a whole bunch of women with bikinis on made out of seashells, including Mamie Van Doren, and added extra plot to the movies so that they look good. But he used the special effects in particular from the Russian one to make Roger Corman movies. It's the same thing that happened with Planet of Blood. It stole, well, not stole, I keep saying stole, but Corman poached the footage from Russian science fiction movies to use as the special effects parts of some movies that he patched together with character actors in them. In Planet of Blood, it was Florence Marley and Basil Rathbone and John Saxon and Dennis Hopper. But in this one, I haven't watched the 2 American versions. I don't need to. I don't particularly want to. But Planeta by itself is great fun. The story is very straightforward. Doesn't tell you what year it's set in, which I'm grateful for because it doesn't make it ridiculous then. But 3 ships, the Cirrus, the Vega, and the Capella, are sent to Venus to explore Venus. Now, this is old school Venus. This is jungle Venus. This isn't a pottery kiln Venus that we know to be the real case. And the 3 ships head to Venus. Capella, the 3rd ship, gets hit by a meteor and gets destroyed. So the other 2 ships and their crews have to figure out how they're going to complete the mission, because their original mission plans required 3 ships. One to stay in orbit as a refueling vessel, the other 2 to land on the planet and explore. So the plan they come up with the help of the robot, which is an AI robot, and a big chunky bugger at that, one of the ships stays in orbit with one of the crew members, a woman called Masha, aboard. Now, a glider from that ship will take 2 men and the robot down to the surface of the planet. The robot will stay there. The other 2 men will come back with all the samples. And the other ship will land as normal and do all the science stuff they've got to do, meeting up with the other guys and bringing them back into orbit so they can get on the other spaceship and go back to Earth. So they work out a plan. The robot, by the way, is called John. I would have called it Stalin, which means man of iron, but that's just me. So the ship goes down to the surface of Venus, and almost immediately, one of the astronauts gets attacked by a carnivorous plant. They stop it from consuming him. They then go, oh, there's life on this planet, which is fair enough. They find out that there's life on the planet, mostly in the form of a great big carnivorous plant at first. But they do find other life forms. They find giant brontosauruses there. They find flying pterodactyl things. They also find kind of velociraptor, human-sized dinosaurs, which are people in suits, and they don't tend to overuse that because it looks a bit silly. And they find a lot of undersea life and some hints of artifacts as well, and hints that there were at some stage intelligent beings on the planet. And this movie takes itself very seriously. It's a fairly slow pace compared to something like Phantom Planet, but it's slow paced and methodical, and it takes its science seriously. And there are some interesting psychological things that happen too. Masha is up in orbit and loses contact with the people on the surface. So she doesn't know whether she should come down and try to rescue them, or whether she should head back to Earth. And if she does that and the guys are okay on the surface, they're trapped on Venus. So there are a lot of things going on there where she is isolated. She's like the Michael Collins in Apollo 11, circling the moon while the other 2 guys go down on the surface. Of course, the movie was made before Apollo 11. Maybe that's where they got the idea. They go down to the surface and travel across the surface. They travel through swamps. They travel across a sea. They actually sink their little cool car, which looks a bit like Supercar from the Jerry Anderson TV series in the early 1960s. They actually sink it to the bottom of the ocean and carry it across the bottom of the ocean to land because they're being attacked by a pterodactyl, and the only way to stop it from attacking them is to sink the boat and carry it ashore, which I'm kind of like. There's a lot of improvisation goes on here. There's also a mud volcano which erupts, and superheated mud traps two of the guys. There's also some different perils that the guys meet on the surface of the planet. There's a bit where two of them get their suits breached and get an infection, and they have to take antibiotics for it, but in order to do that, they've got to lie still for 24 hours, and they're not in a situation where they can lie still for 24 hours. So they have to keep moving and get to the point where by the time they find a cave and get under shelter from the rain that's pouring down, the infections are pretty advanced, and the robot has to give them their medication so that they can heal and continue the mission. So there's a lot of little bits like that which really work in this movie and are really well thought out, but it is a very kind of self-serious film. Nonetheless, the production values are fantastic. The special effects of the spaceships are good. The model works great. The evocation of the surface of the planet is great. They've got lots of alien plants, and they do that wonderful thing which I love in this kind of movie, where when they're under the ocean they put an aquarium in front of the camera, between the camera and the actors, and they shoot through the aquarium so it looks like they're under the ocean. I love that kind of stuff. And again, that's something that Jerry Anderson did with his Super Mario Nation TV series when they had to shoot under the water. You put a fairly shallow fish tank in between and just shoot through the fish tank. I kind of miss that kind of special effects work, to be honest with you. It really works well for me. I've got a real love of that kind of thing. Now, the spaces are pretty good as well. Like the spaceship cabins all look realistic with the dials and the switches, all the things you expect of that. They're a lot more complex too than the control panels you normally see in American science fiction space opera of the time. This movie takes the science seriously. It's not disregarding it, it's trying to keep it real in an unreal way, which I suppose is a reason why Roger Corman used these films. Their special effects were great, way beyond anything Roger Corman could ever hope to do. And there were a lot of really good special effects technicians working in Russia at the time on various projects like The Sky Beckons, another one of those science fiction movies that Russia did. The special effects work, combining model work with forced perspective and animation and all sorts of other things, not going in the same direction that America did with the special effects that were coming out of American science fiction movies, and creating their own kind of aesthetic and their own look with these Russian Fantastica science fiction movies. I really appreciate that. There's something very much of their own, and there's become, over the years, an increased appreciation of Russian science fiction and fantasy movies. Things like V, which I've mentioned on the channel before, and this one, and of course Solaris, the Tarkovsky Solaris and Stalker and other movies like that. Technological optimism within the Soviet system, of course, gives these movies a really distinctive look. And there's an interesting lot of conversations between the astronauts in Planeta, where they're discussing where did this intelligent life come from on Venus. It couldn't have evolved here because the life on Venus is still around the level of dinosaurs. So where did it come from, and who are they? And did they come from Earth? Did they come from Atlantis? Did they come from somewhere else? Are they transplanted Martians when Mars dried up? There's a lot of this kind of speculation there where they're just throwing out ideas to each other, not getting any solid answers, but just kind of having a chat about them and trying to figure this stuff out on the hop. Planeta is a really interesting film for that reason. It's got its own look. It's a kind of picaresque movie where they're traveling across an alien landscape to try to get from A to B and to be ultimately rescued, which is a theme which is going to be in science fiction movies for as long as there are going to be science fiction movies. But yes, it is a little stodgy, and yes, the actors are very self-serious. There's not a lot of humour in the movie. The fact that they've got a female astronaut for a start works. And one of the things that the movie was criticised for in Russia at the time was the fact that Masha, the woman in orbit, breaks down emotionally and is a little kind of less competent and less confident than the male characters. And the movie critics and various authorities at the time kicked back on that and said, no, Soviet women are just as competent as the men, and this shouldn't happen in this kind of a movie, which I find an interesting approach and very forward-looking in a way that American critics weren't addressing in all the egregious sexism of American science fiction space operas at the time. You got to give props where it's due. Just to finalize everything here, Phantom Planet, very American, very low budget 1960s, but a lot of fun if you can get into the headspace of a little kid in the 1960s. Planeta, you can look at it as a historical artifact. You can look at it as an artifact of technological optimism within the Soviet system. And there was a technological optimism in America as well, which wasn't always reflected in science fiction cinema, but it definitely was there. How are they going to get out of this? Are the two groups of people who are landed on the planet going to meet up? Is the robot going to go berserk and try to kill people, or is it going to be reasonable? And the robot's got the same kind of logic and its own limitations. And so, because of those limitations and logic, it becomes as complete a character as any of the other ones in the film. It was good to double feature these two coming from very, very different cultures and very different political and philosophical viewpoints, and yet still having that technological optimism in common. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Doesn't cost you anything to subscribe, but it does cost you something to become a channel member, or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/CherryTalksMovies, and it will help the channel in future. Next up, I've got a live stream I'm doing on Monday, and I'll post a link to that. And if you are subscribed, you'll get a notification when that's coming up. And I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different things, including Beetlejuice, which we just saw at the cinema. So until all of that stuff happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some movies from America, watch some movies from Russia. Just have a good time and enjoy yourself. And I'll catch you next time.